Hello and welcome to our on-demand video series on SQL Server. I'm TJ Turner, a design sales engineer here at Synex, and today we're going to talk about using the cloud adoption framework and what it needs and takes to get SQL migrated into Azure and the planning steps and everything that goes along with using the cloud adoption framework when it comes to SQL. The biggest thing is that, and I think as a business landscape, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, CEOs understand that we have this digital transformation that is their biggest priority. And what's behind that is a lot of times that is SQL Server. We understand that in today's world is SQL is usually the data backbone to an organization, and everything that the organization holds really lives in a database of some sort, whether that's SQL or some other form with on-premise or in the cloud or in some way some other system that you may have either built from the ground up or are utilizing in some way, shape, or form, whether that's an SAP system or the sky is the limit essentially to what's out there to help your digital landscape as an organization. But as an organization, the CEOs see this and the way that the movement is in the technology world around this is the trend that we're seeing today, that we need to move and even into the cloud so that we can be a little bit more adaptive to what's going on. What does that mean? Well, that change is difficult for people to understand because it really is, it's impacting the people of the organization, the culture of the organization, the people outside of the organization, your customers, your partners, all of these levels of things that your organization does. It requires some new thinking and new disruptive thinking in a way that we're not used to doing. It requires a culture shift within the organization, and that your leadership needs to take some risks because it's new territory. We don't understand everything yet. And that means we also need to be able to adapt and learn very quickly to what's going on. And so that means, well, we need to have a different landscape. We can't necessarily take all of that capital risk within our organization either. And so how do we do this? Well, we need to harness data impactfully and efficiently so it can help any business transform into a confident way, transform confidently into the ways that they need to quickly and the way the market is asking them to. So data makes business possible. And then we also understand that our data and that database behind it is really what drives a lot of what we do and how we make decisions on a day-to-day basis. So Microsoft's come up with this cloud adoption framework for Azure, and it helps us kind of put things in a process with the technology and the people all in a way that allows us to leverage some of these new cloud technology things. This cloud technology or this cloud adoption framework, cloud fundamentally has changed how enterprises procure, any business procures technology today. Securing, using, and traditionally enterprises owned a lot of things. They managed their data centers. They had different aspects of technology. They managed the infrastructure, the software, the networking, the internet providers, all of these things. But moving to the cloud, enterprises can now provision, consume resources only when they're needed, as opposed to having to buy in advance. And although the cloud offers some flexibility and design choices, enterprises needed proven and consistent methodology for adopting these cloud technologies because they can get out of hand and or not be a good fit sometimes. So the cloud adoption framework that Microsoft's put together is kind of designed to help us extend our practices, especially those of you who are whose business is solely as a provider helping other businesses move their infrastructures and their data into the next wave and next technology to help them be more profitable. So what does this look like? This cloud adoption framework is essentially a 6-step or a 6-process thing, really, that breaks down into about 3 different methodologies. The first one is defining the strategy. What are the goals? What's the business objectives? What's the priorities of all of these projects? Because we can't just move everything all up into the cloud at one time. We need to have a nice plan of attack. And what are those projects that you need to prioritize around that? And along those lines, how do we understand the motivations as to what we need to prioritize for? Do we need to prioritize for cost? We need to prioritize for aging out hardware and all of those things. And so that's around the define strategy portion. The next three, plan, ready, and adopt, are really about getting things into the cloud. And it's really cyclical in a way that it's an ongoing process, always iterating, always learning, always moving forward around those plan, ready, and adopt. So the planning comes from a couple of different things, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit, where it's not so much of define the strategy for each individual project, as we would do here in step one, but the plan is like, okay, what do we need as an organization even to plan to be able to do these projects, especially for partners who are looking to add to their offerings to their customers, to become more strategic to their customers, so they can become a strategic partner as opposed to just a provider of services for them. There's the rationalized digital estate. So what does that really mean? Well, it's some really good words. What is the digital estate? Well, digital estate is really, it's the physical estate. Those items of the hardware, the things that you've accumulated over time here, infrastructure-wise. And those need to be assessed and understand, okay, where can we still utilize these to make it cost-effective for us as opposed to getting rid of everything, and assessing that whole thing. So it's infrastructure migrations, it's also applications, data-driven innovation, stability within the organization, and those kinds of things. It's not as easy just to say, okay, we're going to move everything to the cloud. And so this is the whole framework that helps us plan how we're going to go and get into the cloud as an organization. So first off, we want to define that strategy. And what does that mean for us? Well, cloud delivers fundamental technology benefits. Obviously, I think we understand that. But it can help the enterprise execute multiple business strategies. The cloud allows us to deliver things quicker and faster because we don't have to then wait for the procurement process of hardware or all these other assets that may need to happen. It's already available to us at the drop of a hat, and sometimes just waiting an hour or two for provisioning to happen up in this case, Azure Cloud. But to take advantage of this, we got to start and understand what our business strategy is, because we can't just start moving things without understanding or giving justification even to higher levels and or other partners who we want to move into the cloud. So we need to understand what our motivations are. And those motivations are, do we need to exit our data center? Is it cost savings? Are we want to make sure that we can innovate and bring new technology in and still lessen our capital expenditure? Are we getting mergers and acquisitions? Are we trying to reduce capital expenses? Are we trying to optimize internal operations? Are we trying to lessen our IT footprint and what our IT team has to manage to help us, make sure we're focused on the right things or not? And even to the point of using and reducing carbon footprint as an organization. So we have to classify these motivations and what it's really understanding what our motivations are. Then we need to define our business outcomes. Our business outcomes are important as well, because are we trying to make sure, we need to make sure that from a finance side that we're not overextending ourselves, marketing, sales, human resource, executive leadership. So all that to say, the cloud adoption framework isn't just for IT. This is a communication tool to allow us to build out the items that we need to be able to talk across the organization to help everybody understand what the goal of moving into the cloud and how it benefits us as an organization and they as a department or them as individuals. And so your motivations here is, again, like we've kind of iterated already, cost savings with just migration. You don't have to now manage the hardware side. Hardware is managed in this case by Microsoft with Azure. So you don't have to manage and making sure that you have the latest and greatest hardware. You can, within that migration process, also right size your hardware. So that way you're not having to pay for 5 years worth of compute that you're only going to use in year 4 and 5. You can use and lessen the machine size to say you need a 6 or 8 CPU machine for the next 5 years, but it's only using 2 CPUs right now with maybe even 4 gigs of memory. Well, sending that VM or that workload up into Azure with a 2 CPU, 4 gigs of memory box is a lot cheaper than using a 8 gig 8 CPU 16 gig VM. And the same thing with SQL. If you only have small transactions and you're only using a certain number of having a certain number of transactions right now, you don't need to buy a big swatch of compute. You can grow as your workloads grow, and that's how you're able to see the cost savings within this framework and how your SQL is able to move. And we'll talk about some other pieces that can help us as well as we move into this, but it also helps with business agility. You know, why would you move into the cloud? Business agility, all these really good reasons to help justify the cost. It's not just about cost savings. In some cases, it may be a little bit more, but what you're able to take advantage of is some other features that you weren't able to afford before. So what may amount to, you know, a little bit more a month or a year means a lot more. And we'll talk about this at the very end, where we talk about comma thinking, comma philosophy thinking around how we grow and build our business. Innovation is another great way, because within Azure, it's the opportunity to have these other tool sets. And as we talk about in the previous slides, govern and manage, there's a lot more tool sets available that would be really expensive and or difficult to implement and to grow into. But in Azure, they're there, and as you consume them, then you pay for them. But you can now start to manage and monitor your workloads and applications and usage in a much better, more efficient way, so that you as a business and you as an organization can focus on the things that you need to focus on as a practice. Defining those business outcomes is an outcome to increase revenue, try to save costs, drive profit, be agile to our market. Our market's ever changing, and a lot of markets are changing now very, very rapidly. Well, we can't acquire hardware fast enough in some cases to be able to adapt and change. Azure allows for us within certain parts of the tool sets that we have available that we can be agile. We can scale up and scale down. We can scale out and scale up and back down based on our workloads. Within Azure too, if your reach can be very much global or even specific to certain areas, so that you know that your customers have their information as quickly as they possibly can. Along those lines, there's data sovereignty stuff. So government and certain regions require certain things. Those are all available to you, where you don't have to go and get those very expensive certifications to be able to do and provide services to certain customers. Performance, as Azure and Microsoft is managing all of these workloads and things, a lot of that performance issues and those things you have help with, especially here with Synnex. You can come to us. We'll then be able to open up tickets and talk directly with Microsoft as your support provider. Security and compliance, regulations, and certifications and all of those things are taken very seriously by Microsoft. And it's the best way to actually help, because Microsoft takes security very seriously. They spend a lot of money year over year making sure that they're watching and managing securely everybody's information, to the point where I'm very safe to say that your information going into Azure is probably more secure than being in your on-prem environment. So as we move into the planning phase, as we move out of strategy, now I'll kind of back up a little and say, around the cloud adoption framework, this is a very broad and very specific at the same time type of framework that you can use. So you need to use this and at your what's going to work for your organization. It doesn't have to follow exactly in everything, and you may pick and choose pieces throughout each one of these steps that works for you and that doesn't work for you based on the size of your practice. So as we plan, we have to talk about a few things. The digital estate that I talked about earlier, the organizational alignment, planning for how we're going to move things and the adoption and things of that sort. The skills readiness, and skills readiness is what skills do we need in-house to be able to execute on some of this strategy. And then what is our cloud adoption plan, which is basically building out the adoption plan to manage and change across the digital estate skills and within the organization as to what do we want to own, what do we need to, what can we push up, how do we want to manage that, do we have the resources in-house, do we need to go hire resources to help us do this. And so as we talk about the rationalize of the digital estate, there's what's called the 5 R's, and we have 3 of them here, and we'll talk about them a little bit more later. But we have the rehost, refactor, and retire. What these really boil down to is this is an opportunity, and I know we don't like to put a lot of change into our projects as we make a big change, as in moving to the cloud. And that's the beauty of what you have moving into Azure, even with this cloud adoption framework. Because you can move everything into the Azure the way that it is right now, running VMs, running SQL Server, running the web apps that you've self-developed and other applications, and people access them in similar ways that they are today. Then when you're ready to take the next step, you can then start doing some of that rehost or the refactor, or even retiring assets, as in if we move into the cloud, we can retire our on-premise assets. But also when you get up everything there and it's all working, maybe this is the opportunity to refactor some things. Oh, we're going to move into, as we'll talk about and see in later videos, how we can migrate into using newer SQL versions. Say they're on SQL Server 2008. Well, support just ended last year in July of 2019. You need, if you want to be able to have support or have issues within that SQL database, you're going to need to move into the cloud that's able to take advantage of some of those things, and you can move off of that server 2008 so that you now are back in support, in the support levels of that database. The rehost is kind of self-explanatory. You can move things and rehost them into Azure, and this is obviously a time that you can then right size them and change them as you see workloads change and monitor them a little bit better. On to the skills readiness part of it, you need to identify where your gaps are, even as an organization, and know who has the tools, and maybe what you need to do before you can start moving into anything is maybe go to the Microsoft Learn site and start learning about what's in Microsoft Azure and the skill sets that they might use. There are lots of correlations to what you're doing on-prem. However, things in the cloud are implemented a little bit differently. Then you also want to look across teams, because this isn't just about IT anymore. There are skills that are available throughout other teams that maybe you can push to them and say, now you guys can manage this part of this application or this part of this product or this part of this project, and not just be solely owned by IT. And now you're building out relationships within the organization across teams, and everybody has buy-in as well. And it also might mean that you need to establish a new team, AKA if you're big enough as an organization, you might need to have a cloud governance team, or even a cloud enablement team whose sole job is to help build out the plans of moving or knowing if we should move something into the cloud, keep it on premise, or do something completely different. And as you put that plan together, the cloud adoption plan is then the prerequisites, prioritizing what projects and workloads should go first and how they should go, then aligning those assets, define the iterations and releases, because there might be development work that needs to happen if you have a self-developed, in-house developed application, and then building timelines that are actually realistic and with giving, estimates, because now you have this plan. And as you start to build these estimates as well and build this plan out, this is a great opportunity to talk about how maybe we don't need to do this traditional method of running projects, of the waterfall. Okay, everything here, we're going to plan. Now we're going to plan this part and get this part done. Okay, let's say we're going to move SQL Server up. And we want to refactor only on the application side the SQL Server connection. We can get SQL into Azure while still running everything on-prem, which is a simple VPN connection. Those kinds of iterative processes allow you to then slowly mitigate your risk, but slowly move into where you want to be and even refactor along the way. So say in that example of running SQL Server up in Azure, whether that's the 3 different types of ways you can run SQL, you are running your on-premise application against that SQL database, but now you want to refactor that application and run it in the app services option in Azure. Well, now you can start building the app services against that database that you already have in Azure, test, and then QA, and be ready for production, and slowly move into the app services workloads if you so desire to refactor. And then when you're ready to do that and move everything over, now you can just shut off your on-premise applications and on-premise VMs, and you don't have to worry about migrating the VMs over and making sure all of the settings are there. You've already done that on the back end, and you didn't have to spend any extra expenses on capital other than what it costs to run those services in Azure. Microsoft's also provided a cloud adoption plan template that we can give you here. And this will just, again, I say pick and choose the things that make sense for you and your organization. That's the beauty of this framework, is it's just a framework. It's not a step-by-step process of how you have to migrate into the cloud. So next we're going to go to Ready. This is where the Azure setup guide, the first landing zone and landing zones, and we won't go into landing zones per se in this. It's a little bit bigger than just what we have time for here. But we want to go through that setup guide and what's required in Azure for us to run these workloads that we're going to want to move. In our case, SQL. Here's what we're talking about today. So we want to organize and we want to manage that access, making sure we got our access controls in place, make sure we have our service principals in place, make sure we have our APIs or service accounts in place too, and groups and policies and all of those things available so that SQL is can work for us in Azure the way we need to. Again, since SQL is a real critical piece, if it doesn't work, and you go in and you're moving into Azure, the issue may not necessarily be Azure, but how it's implemented in Azure. And then it's going to give everybody a bad taste for moving into the cloud. And that's what this framework's hopefully there to help avoid, is giving for that planning so that you can have a successful migration. And in many respects, people don't know that it migrated. And it all just works on the end. And you worked tirelessly and hard to get there, but it's all there for you, and then you have a successful and you're running in the cloud. Identify data service requirements, and this is where it's really important, obviously understanding what services you're going to move. SQL has a lot of dependencies, right? Whether it's applications or API calls or backup plans or all of these things that might tie into your SQL database, those all need to be documented. Even the types, and it might be beneficial to you to know, even in Azure, there's MySQL and Postgres and available as well. There's Cosmos DB, which is it's a different database structure. So that's the refactoring part of the framework too, is that everything may not need to go into a SQL database. We might need to use some of these smaller, lower end, or not as feature rich databases, or use a different open source database like MySQL, Postgres, or MariaDB. These are all available to you in Azure. So we have a lot of common scenarios here where it's Azure Cosmos is I need a globally distributed multi-model database that supports NoSQL. There's lots of things available to you in Azure, and a way that you can refactor and or take advantage of these things as you look forward and as you plan into moving your SQL workloads up. There's 3 main ways that SQL moves into Azure. One of them is what you're used to on-premise, which is the Azure SQL Virtual Machine. That's essentially just infrastructure as a service. You don't necessarily manage the hardware, but you have access to the OS layer. You have to install SQL Server. You have to manage SQL Server. You're in charge of essentially everything on that machine. And that may be required based on certain features that you need and certain things that you're using on premise today. The other two, platform as a service, where you don't have to manage the hardware or the OS on the back end, is the SQL managed instance, which is going to closely mimic what you have with on-premise. So you have things like a full index search is available in the managed instance. The Azure SQL database is really where you want to build some of your new apps and or migrate into, because it's one less thing you have to manage. On the managed instance, you get a little bit more management of the SQL itself, of the SQL server itself, but you don't have access to everything. Again, it's a platform that you can then build towards, but you have a little bit more control in the managed instance side. Whereas on the SQL database side, the Azure SQL database side, a lot of that's kind of pulled back and you get to use those features. And as new features come available, they're there as well. And we can go through some of those things and the differences between the managed instance and the SQL database in a later video. So which one do you select? Well, if you need a specific version of SQL Server or a specific operating system, then we use Azure SQL virtual machines. You'll have all the control that you would need to say, oh, I need to run on Server 2012 and I need to run SQL Server 2012 as well. But if none of these are required, then you say else. If I need instant level capabilities, such as SQL agent, a service broker, link server, then I'll use the SQL managed instance. These are the features that are available in the managed instance. Otherwise, you want to be an Azure SQL database. So what are our motivations for choosing which one, either the VM databases or the managed instance or the Azure SQL? Cost, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. Based on what you need to look at that cost. And we at Synnex can help you look at all of those things. And we'll go over what a DTU is, which is available in the Azure SQL databases, which isn't available in a managed instance, or the SQL virtual machines, where then you're in the vCore model of pricing. You can do vCore modeling in the Azure SQL databases as well, but DTU, which are kind of pre-configured around storage transactions, SQL transactions, and CPU workloads, and we'll talk about what goes into that algorithm to define the DTU. Also, you want to look at administration. What do you really need to have from a SQL administration standpoint? Do you need to have that tight, granular control over everything that SQL server does? Well, that means maybe you need to be in the SQL virtual machines, as opposed to being in even a managed instance, where you get a little bit more control than the Azure SQL database. But if you need tighter control. Now, both infrastructure as a service and PaaS, as we move over into the service level agreements, provide high SLAs. The PaaS option, as you can see here, guarantees a 99.99% service level agreement, while the infrastructure guarantees 99.95. Now, what does that mean on the number side? Well, we'll have to do the math, but I think all of us understand what those numbers, we can at least get those numbers very readily by just either doing an internet search on what is the actual number across the year for 99.99% and versus 99.95%. And that depends on what your workloads need to be. You can also implement high availability solutions across all of those instances. Obviously, if the SQL Server and the VM, you're going to have to configure an always-on availability group, and that's done at the SQL Server level and all of those things that go into that. Again, that's another server that's got to be initiated. And in the other levels, we can do different things as well. So as we adopt and we move into the adoption phase, this is where you actually are going to start to move workloads into Azure. What does that look like? Well, again, it's kind of using the same framework, right? We got to plan, ready, and adopt as we move each piece. And there are tools that Microsoft provides to being able to do that. But we need to do some stuff ourselves, assessing what assets need to go and where and how and all of those things. And then we talk about the 5 R's. When we talk about the 5 R's, and I'll come back to this slide in just a second, we talk about rehost, we talk about refactor, we talk about re-architecting, meaning is this a chance for us to re-architect certain things that we've needed to do because we've been on old technology or old software, we haven't been able to do that. And now this might be the catalyst that allows us to get the funding to be able to do some of that re-architecture. Do we rebuild certain things, or do we just completely replace? So in some cases, we just replace our SQL Server system, not necessarily the database itself, but we're going to replace the hardware that it's running on back to when we move to Azure. Or do we replace it completely altogether and move to a software as a service solution? All of these things are part of the rationalization as we move through the framework. Migration uses a combination of, you can use third-party tools, which are available, and some of those are at cost, and you'd have to look at those and factor that into your overall financial goal of migrating. You're going to optimize your environment. So once you get things up, maybe it makes sense for you to then, okay, now we can see how performance is working, because there might be some concern, and to lessen that the risk that you have available, or the risk that is there, it might be beneficial to then, okay, we're going to oversize everything right now, look at the workloads, and then resize when we get back. So your first month's bill, per se, if you're looking at the financial part of it, might be a little higher than you anticipate. However, once you are able to resize and refactor, that bill can either be a lot less, and then it makes sense for that first bill to be up. So that way you know that you're taking less risk and making sure that everything's available to your end customers, and that you aren't essentially putting yourself in a business impactful situation. Secure and manage is very important as well. And as we talk through that, Azure takes and Microsoft takes security very, very seriously. We're here as we talk through this. Microsoft has multiple clouds, but two of them one is Azure, as we understand, and the second is Azure Active Directory, which is a separate cloud in and of itself that allows for authentication and security as its mechanism. Azure takes advantage of that Azure Active Directory to be able to do its users and permissioning. So as we look for database migrations, we're going to look at the discovering and making sure that the features that are being used on our database are available in Azure, or in the instance that we want to use. We're going to assess what application dependencies we have. We're going to look for, and then we're going to choose the deployment option in Azure that's going to make sense. The migrate option, migrate here, we replicate on-prem functionality using the cloud native. And it might just be able to say, okay, we're going to replicate to the cloud as opposed to replicating on-premise. And now we're able to leverage both in a hybrid environment. Then we're going to migrate the source, and then you can now connect your things to your replicated instance, and there's hardly any downtime from a cutover standpoint. Optimize, now you can start to see in the governance and manage part of the framework, you can start to see what the performance is on this database. Where you might have tools and stuff to do that on premise, those tools can work with Azure SQL and those things, but it might be a little bit different and might be new tools that you have to initiate. So then here's the tools that are available. So we can assess with the Azure Migrate. We have a data migration assistant, and then we have the SQL Server migration assistant as well. These, all of these things, the goal here is to enable successful Azure migration, regardless of what tool you use. There's a great set of first-party tools that Microsoft provides that are built into Azure and free to get started with. But you also have a lot of third-party tools that are available as well. There's third parties with ISVs that, if you want, like BitTitan or things of that sort, to have some level of, if you want the third-party work in the mix, there are tools available to you to make sure that if you feel more comfortable with lessening that risk and the changes that take place, you have tools that are designed to help with that process. And again, We have the assessment tools that can take on-premise SQL Server and all of these things with Data Migration Assistant, SQL Server Migration Assistant, and then migrate into your SQL, and gives you, and we can see in a demo in another video here, what that data migration will look like. And it will do an assessment and say, oh, no, this database is not going to be available to go into even an Azure SQL instance. But then you do it against a managed instance, and it says, yes, this is compatible with a managed instance. Lastly, as we move through the framework, right, you have the govern and the manage part. So once you've got everything up into Azure, now we need to make sure that we are managing these things and governing those things as they should be, making sure data is only accessed the way it's supposed to be. And in SQL and Azure SQL and the options that you have there's some security and encryption and things of that sort that are available to you via native SQL, and making sure that you're watching even making sure if you're holding credit card data, that is encrypted and secured, and machine learning also understands, oh no, we need to make sure that that's not accessible any other which way. I won't talk much about this because it's a whole nother topic in and of itself, but once you've got and move SQL into Azure, these things will become more important, especially as ongoing management and maintenance. As we look at SQL and moving it into Azure, this is a growth opportunity in extending your offerings, especially as a partner, as you can be and leverage this cloud adoption framework as the way that you go about establishing or assessing business that you want to take on. And essentially kind of what we talk about is comma thinking. This is another way that you can add business and add revenue to your organization. Instead of what we tend to do in IT is we tend to think about saving money and expenses and keeping everything low. What if instead we think more around the comma and think about how we're adding and growing and building more business, adding more revenue, not only to ourselves, not only to you as a partner, but also to your end customer. If you're able to give them ways that they can build more and be faster in their market and get more features and add more customers, it makes more sense for them to be able to go into and use you, as we there at the very end there, become their strategic partner. And now you're having dialogue and you're being able to help them build their business, as opposed to just being a service arm when something goes wrong or making sure that their infrastructure is staying up. I appreciate your time today. Thank you for our first session.